right. Well, yeah. Lovely to see you all. And the first thing to say, I said it in the tutorials, but I'll say it again here. Congratulations, you've already mastered your first formal language. And what we're going to do now is we're going to start on our second one. Now is when the first of many fun steps begin. Because the move to first order logic is a significant step forward in terms of grammatical complexity, but it also means that we're able to do a whole lot more. And really, this is the big language that when people talk about learning classical logic, that's what this is. So our aim for today, I've got a whole bunch of stuff. And I want to start off by talking to you about the very basic building blocks of first order logic. In particular, I want to talk to you about what we're going to call terms and predicates. And then also quantifiers, which is going to be one of our new tools, and the notion of domains, which go hand in hand with quantifiers. Now, I definitely want to get through that. And then what I'd like to do is to try and get through as much of this stuff about FOL symbolizations as we can. In particular, I want to talk to you about 4 kind of general sentence structures that we're going to see a whole lot. And I want to make sure that we understand how to do those. And if we get through that, we're good. If we manage to get through paraphrase and quantifier scope 2, wonderful. If not, it's not the end of the world. We got 3 weeks on this stuff. So we're going to go as much as we can. We'll see how it goes. And as for this last bit, it is no problem at all if we don't cover it today. So this is aspirational, but the big aim for today is to make sure we've got a grip on the fundamental building blocks of the language, and we start in on some of our symbolization. Sounds good? Beautiful. All right, so FOL building blocks. First thing we're going to start with is a kind of joke. And I'm sorry, I made the joke in a bunch of the tutorials last week, but hey, it doesn't hurt to hear it again. So here's an argument. We've seen this argument or something like it before. First question, is the argument valid? Just as it's written in natural language. Valid? Yeah, right? Yeah. It's very similar to the very first question we talked about in the very first tutorial. But think about, how would we symbolize this into TFL? Put another way, do the premises tautologically entail the conclusion? I won't put you in suspicion for very long, but the problem is they don't. Because if we symbolize this into TFL, we have to treat each sentence as an atom. Because remember, that's the basic unit of TFL. So we end up with something like this, right? Our first premise is H, our second is M, and our third is S. And it's real easy to come up with a valuation that makes the premises true and the conclusion false, because a valuation is where we just assign whatever truth value we want to the relevant atoms. So TFL tells us that this argument doesn't come out as valid. In a way, what TFL shows us is that there isn't anything just purely at the sentential level, the structure of the sentences of the premises and the conclusion, that guarantees its validity. But that's okay, right? TFL doesn't show us this argument's valid because TFL is a blunt instrument. It's really good most of the time, but sometimes you need finer tools. And that's what FOL is. FOL is a finer tool. The key difference is that it's not going to be constrained to operate purely at the level of sentences. Put another way, FOL, first order logic, lets us split the atom in the sense that we're going to have subsentential parts. And our base unit is going to be a combination of subsentential parts. So it's not going to be the kind of one-by-one immutable, unbreakable Lego that it was in TFL. It's going to be two little one-by-one blocks we put together to get us our base unit. But it's going to operate once we have that base unit basically the same. But importantly, if we symbolize this argument in FOL, we could get it to look something like this. Now note, to go back a slide, just look at our first premise, right? Our first premise, we symbolized it in FOL just simply with a capital letter because there's no subsentential part. That's just, it's sort of all it is. It's just this immutable atomic atom. Well, here, what we're going to have is two parts, and this is the most basic of an FOL sentence. I'm going to talk to you about what the parts are in a bit. But importantly, right, we're no longer going to just have capital letters on their own. It's always, the minimum unit is always going to be at least one capital letter and at least one lowercase letter. Something like this or something like this. Those are going to be our new basic units. And it's important because what this actually lets us do is we can pinpoint when we're talking about the same person, right? So this little thing represents Socrates. It's his name, as it were. And because it's the same name in 1 and in 3, we can make sure we're still holding on to the same guy. Which is one of the reasons why the argument is in fact valid in natural language. Remember, we talked about it using the sort of Venn diagrams. And in the Venn diagram case, we saw it. But that was because we could pin Socrates. FOL is going to give us tools to do that. So this is just kind of a jokey motivation, but it starts to let you see the move that we're going to make. So let's talk about the fundamentals of first-order logic. The first thing to note is that we are going to double the type of symbols that we have available to us. If you remember, TFL was made up of 3 symbols. We had the atoms, the connectives, and the brackets. Well, now we're going to have terms, of which there's 2 types, names and variables. We're going to have predicates. We'll have the connectives just like we did before. We'll have the brackets just like they did before. And we're also going to have 2 new operators, our quantifiers. Our basic unit, I'm going to say this a lot because it's very important to get this. Our base unit from now on is going to be a predicate and a term. It might be a name or it might be a variable, but it's always going to be at least predicate and term. That's our replacement for an atomic sentence. So what I want to do is go through these new ones one by one. I want to talk to you about what names are, how they work, how we symbolize them. What variables are, how they work, and how we symbolize them. And then we'll talk a little bit about predicates. That's going to be the basic bits. And then we'll get, once we're clear with those, we'll talk about quantifiers. Cool? As usual, if you've got questions, stop me along the way, okay? So names. Before we talk about names in FOL, it's helpful to think about names in natural language. I'm a monolinguistic sod, so we'll have to talk about it in English. But in English, there's at least 2 types of names. There's what we might think of as singular terms. Singular terms are a word or phrase that refers to a specific entity. Contrast that with a general term, which picks out a kind or a type. Take Mira and dog. Mira is a singular term. If it picks anything out, it picks out my dog. Whereas dog is a kind of name for the kind or the species or the type. A very confusing one is, of course, Piglet from Winnie the Pooh and Piglet, the type of thing that he is. But you can see the difference, right? A singular term purports to name an individual object. A general term names something like a kind. So those are both types of terms. Sorry, I think I said name earlier. Apologies. Terms. But when we think of types of singular terms, they come in at least two varieties in English. One of those types is going to be proper names. And these are the kinds of things that in some sense pick out an object without really telling you anything about it. The fact that my dog's name is Mira doesn't even tell you that she's a dog. The ending gestures at the fact that she's a she, if, of course, that name comes from a kind of Romance language, right? But it doesn't actually tell you anything to know that this Mira is a name to pick out that object. Proper names pick out without offering any description. Contrast this with what we might call definite descriptions. And definite descriptions are, as the name suggests, a description that picks out exactly one object. The tallest person in the room, whoever that might be. Yeah, everybody looks. But note, it doesn't matter who that actually picks out. We understand how that functions as a singular term, right? It picks out whoever it is in the room, maybe that guy right there, right? Picks out whoever is in the room who actually has the property of being the tallest person. So it gives you a description, and by finding out that the description picks out just one person, you found a way to individuate. Right? Another easy example, Socrates versus the teacher of Plato, or the most famous teacher of Plato. The most famous teacher of Plato gives you a definite description. Socrates is a proper name, but they both are singular terms to pick out the same dude. So this is a kind of background. That's how it works in English. In FOL, we're going to have roughly the same idea. So remember, we have two types of terms in FOL. The first type of term are names. Names are going to be expressed by lowercase letters. They're going to be expressed by the lowercase letters A through R. We'll need the other ones for something else. Names are going to be expressed by lowercase a through R, and if we need the subscripts, we can use the subscripts, right? So you can write the numbers underneath. How do they function? They function just like English proper names. That is, they pick objects out, but they give you no descriptive qualities of the thing. It's just a way to kind of tag or label an object. Notably though, unlike in most natural languages, for FOL, we do not allow for any ambiguity. What that means is that we don't allow the same name to pick out multiple objects. Here's an easy one. I'm not sure in this class, but certainly in other classes I've taught, there's been at least like 8 dudes named Yan. Right? So Yan doesn't really function as an FOL proper name because it designates too many people. In FOL, we allow one name per object. In the sense that for each object, there must be at least, well, I shouldn't say that. For each name, there must be at least one object. Let's put it that way. For each name, there must be at least one object. And each name picks out exactly one thing. So we don't allow for any ambiguity. We don't allow for any kind of over-determination in the names. Notably, we will allow for one object to have multiple names. So we can talk about, I don't know, Bruce Wayne and Batman. If we have one as little b1 and one as little b2, both of those can designate the same entity. That's perfectly fine. But importantly, for our language, for FOL, we cannot have a name that picks out nothing. We cannot have what we call an empty name, like, say, Bruce Wayne, which doesn't actually pick out anything. So, for FOL, right, the names which are expressed through lowercase a through R, could be with subscripts. For each one of them, they name exactly one thing. And for every name, there must be some object that it names. Cannot have a name that doesn't pick anything out. So FOL in some ways takes the idea of proper names from natural language and just kind of idealizes it a little bit. No ambiguity, no emptiness. Cool so far? Please. Good. We're going to talk about where the other ones go in just a second. Next slide. We're going to use those for our other types of terms. Because remember, there's two types of terms. There's names and there's variables. We're going to use the other little lowercase letters for our variables. Now, notably, an FOL symbolization key is going to be more complex than a TFL one was. Here, at least part of an FOL symbolization key is going to tell you what names map to certain objects. So for example, right, we've got lowercase a picking out Socrates, lowercase m for Mira, and lowercase n for Nathan. So far, so good. That's our first little bit. The second kind of element to our language, to pick up exactly where we were just talking about, is going to be our other type of term. So we have names. Names are A through R. Variables are going to be S through Z, or Z if you're an American like me. They can be with or without subscripts, whatever you like. Oh, sorry. It was I think you were twirling the pen and I thought you had your hand up. Sorry, man. So, variables, we write them as lowercase letters, S through R, or S through Z. Could be with the subscripts. Now, these ones don't function like names. That is, they don't just pick out objects. Instead, they function a little bit more like, almost like pronouns. Or even better, they're ways for us to label gaps. They give us a way to indicate gaps we can fill in by potentially plugging in names or objects. So I can say something like, hey, X loves Y even though Y doesn't love X. X and Y here aren't standing in as names. They're not picking out particular individuals. They're helping me track that I want to keep talking about the same person in certain places. I want the same person to be here and here, and potentially a different person to be here and here. In effect, what I'm suggesting is let's use variables just like you probably did in algebra or trigonometry or any one of your other math classes before. If you've dealt with those kinds of things, find X, you know how to do variables. Literally the same idea. So, we express them using the lowercase s through z. They don't function like names. They don't pick objects out. And because they don't function like names, a symbolization key doesn't need to tell us what they represent because they don't represent fucking anything. In some sense, they stand for everything. They're just pronouns, and we'll need other bits of a machinery to tell us how to replace them. Okay, so there's our first two bits. Terms, names, or variables. The other fundamental unit here are predicates. Predicates in natural language, for those of you who haven't kind of done parts of speech or anything, are parts of language that you can broadly understand as ascribing properties. So, is in the logic class, a dog slobbered on, is from Greece, likes anime, whatever. Those expressions, which are incomplete, right? They don't express a sentence by themselves. You need to fill in a term. He likes anime. She is from Greece. You all are in the logic class. You see the idea, right? The predicate by itself is only part of a sentence. You need to plug in a term to get you a full sentence. Predicates link up to give us complete sentences. Socrates, so the name, Socrates, and the predicate is human, taken together gives us the English atomic sentence, Socrates is human. You see the idea. In FOL, our predicates are going to be expressed by capital letters with subscripts if we need them. And when we write them into our symbolization key, what we'll do, at least for now, what we're going to do is we're going to link them up to what their English predicate is. So we'll write, hey, H expresses the predicate is human. Or you might also see it written as HX. And that's just a way to say, hey, X is human. And remember, X is a variable that we could replace with names. Or T is woke up at 3:30. Or T1 is a terminator. Again, what are we going to do? To get a sentence, we're going to plug in names and variables to give us complete sentences. So what are the first 3 slides that we talked about mean so far? It means that our base unit, to stress it again, is going to be a capital letter and a lowercase letter, a predicate and a term. Sounds good? Makes sense so far? Let's see. So we can begin to get a grip on this FOL stuff by looking at how predicates and terms go together. So we can have this sort of symbolization key. It's going to include a list of relevant names and what they're names for. And it's going to include some predicates and what these predicates express in natural language. And then I could say, hey, HA is a way to say Socrates is human. A satisfies the predicate picked out by H. Or HX is a way to say X is human. But note, here X is a variable, not a name. So this isn't quite a complete sentence yet. We'll talk more about how to finish it off in just a few minutes. And again, I could express TM as Mira woke up at 3:30 using this key here. Or TM conjunction TN, Mira and Nathan woke up at 3:30 this morning. We already start to see too, again, this predicate term base is our unit, and then we can plug and play just like we did before with TFL, but every time before we had atomic sentences, now we're always going to have predicate term combinations. So let's have a go at some practice. This is the same symbolization key we had just a second ago. We have A is the name for Socrates, M for Mira, N for Nathan. H is the predicate is human. T is the predicate woke up at 3:30. T1 is a terminator. So using this key, how would we symbolize Mira woke up at 3:30? TM, right? Capital T, lowercase m, right? Capital T, lowercase m. One thing to note, in some other versions of this language, you could write the name on either side of the predicate. In this one, we're going to go left to right. Predicate's always in the front, and then the first name first. So, we got our first one, easy peasy. How about Socrates is a terminator? T1A, right? T1A. Dun, 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 dun. Good movies. Well, the first two were good. Nathan and Socrates are human. So importantly, what we got to do is keep them as separate sentences, right? So we read this as Nathan is human and Socrates is human. We've got the basic idea. Right? So importantly, right, we'd say Nathan is human, which is HN. And then how do we say and? Yeah, the conjunction. Yeah, nice. Yeah, not a good gesture to make. Right? And then of course, right, how do we do Socrates is human HA. So, taken together, HN conjunction HA. Again, we're getting it? Making sense? We're just initial ones, kind of getting the flow. Right? Okay, and our final one. If Mira woke up at 3:30, then Nathan woke up at 3:30. Either one. Nice. Nice. And note, if we're being strict, we should probably slap some brackets around this one and this one, because the rules about how to use brackets with these connectives still works. But okay, we're all friends here. Relaxed bracketing convention's fine. So, again, the thing to see is every time that before we had an atomic sentence, now we have a predicate and a term. So far, it's just been predicates and names. That's because to use predicates and variables, I'm going to have to introduce you to another bit of our toolkit. But this is the thing to see right off the bat. The simplest thing that we can have here is going to be a predicate and a name. That tells us that the thing picked out by the name satisfies that predicate. So let's talk about our next bit of the toolkit here, the quantifiers. Because between friends, the connectives, conjunction, negation, all that stuff, works exactly like it did before. So we don't have to go over that. You know how to do those. And brackets work just like brackets did before. So we've got two quantifiers. We have the upside down A, and we have the backwards E. The upside down A, this is our universal quantifier. We'll say right off the bat, you will never see a universal quantifier, in fact, any quantifier, you'll never see a quantifier that's not immediately adjacent to a variable. If you see just one of these by itself without the little variable next to it, something's gone wrong. Variables are always attached to quantifiers. Quantifiers are always attached to variables. This variable is, to use the lingo, bound by the quantifier. It serves the quantifier. The universal says all or every. So if I wanted to say this tells me, hey, everything is an H. Everything in the domain is an H. Ooh, spoiled what I'm going to talk about next. Everything is a T. Everything is an F. Doesn't matter necessarily which variables we attach at the moment. Just always, whenever you have a quantifier, gotta be plugged in with a variable. So what is the function here? The function is to say, hey, I'm true, the universal quantifier is true, if and only if you can replace every associated variable with any object you like. So for example, if we take this one, everything is an H. That's going to be true if and only if A is an H, B is an H, C is an H, G is an H, for every damn thing. It's a bit like reading this as a giant conjunction. The universal quantifier is effectively the same as conjunction between predicate, whatever predicate we've attached to, and then every object that we've got plugged in. So, is everyone human? Or everything human? Well, no. I mean, this thing isn't. Again, everything, the universal, genuinely says everything can be plugged in here. You can replace the associated variable with any object in the domain and the sentence will come out true. Okay. So universal says everybody. Right? That's our upside down A. Our backwards E, the existential quantifier, just like with the universal, always adjacent to a variable of some kind. And it's the one that says somebody. Right? It's the one that says for some. It's the one that says effectively, hey, there's at least one. So the function here of the existential is that we can replace the associated variable with some object. In that sense, it's not like the universal in that it's a big conjunction. It's more like a big disjunction. Somebody in here is at least 2 meters tall. That's going to be true if I'm at least 2 meters tall. Definitely not. You are, or you are, or you are, or you are, and we just keep going until we find somebody who is. If there's even one person that we can plug in for the X, then it's going to be true. And note, I've been talking just about the simplified ones, but you can plug these into more complicated sentences. So for example, if we put this quantifier on the outside, it's telling us, hey, there's somebody we can plug in for Y that will make this sentence true. We don't know how or why. We don't really care at the moment. It just says, hey, there's somebody you can plug in for Y that's going to make that sentence in the brackets true. So either we can fill in A and get it true, or we can fill in B or C or D, or, don't matter. Again, we're going to talk about when they're true and false in a bit. Right now, it's just getting the grammar. So, the big thing, right? Whenever you see the universal quantifier for all, or the existential quantifier for some, they're always going to be immediately attached to a variable. That variable is bound to the quantifier. If you see a quantifier that doesn't have a variable, or you see a variable that's not attached or bound to a quantifier, you done fucked up. Something's gone wrong. Okay. Now, the last little bit of kit that we have to talk about. Before that, we'll do some practice. So let's take our key. We've got the same key as before. And let's say everyone is human. Using this key, how would we express everyone is human? Yeah. So universal quantifier X, HX. Everything is human. Is it true? No, but hey, we'll come back to that in a minute. How would we say somebody's human? How do we say someone is human? Again, using this key. Yeah? Yeah. Our existential quantifier X. Note, it doesn't matter that we've used X here. We could have said existential Y, HY. We could have said existential Z, HZ. Existential S, ZS. Don't matter. All that matters is whatever variable we use here is the same one we use in a bit. Before we go on, we feeling okay with this so far? I know we're moving fast, but... So, let's take our third one, right? There's a human, and Mira woke up at 3:30. There's a human, and Mira woke up at 3:30. Yeah? Yeah, right? So, right, it's a conjunction, so we split it, and we can say, first conjunct, existential X, there is a human, HX. So existential X, HX is our first conjunct, and our second one, Mira woke up at 3:30. TM. Beautiful. And our last one, if Socrates is a terminator, then everyone is. If Socrates is a terminator, then everyone is. Maybe we can help ourselves out, right? What's going to be the big connective here? We're thinking about it, right? Looking at the stuff we did last time. Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be our conditional, right? It's going to be our conditional. It's an if-then statement. So let's think about how we would do the parts, right? What's our antecedent? Antecedent is Socrates the Terminator. We know how to do that, right? How would we do Socrates the Terminator? Yeah, right? We did it a few minutes ago. Right? T1, little a. Okay. Now, how would we say everyone's a Terminator? Yeah. Yeah. So universal quantifier x, T1x. Nice. Nice. Now, note, there's a bunch of different ways to write this. But the important thing is we just get to kind of start with this, right? Importantly, much like with last time, what we're going to try and do as we get into the tutorials and things, I'll talk you through lots of different ways to express these. But right now, we just start to kind of focus on some straightforward ones. Again, don't stress if it's not quite clicking yet. We're diving deep right off the bat, right? We're going to practice it. Much like with doing maths or learning language, the way to actually learn this stuff is by doing a bunch of problems. That's why, again, stress. The tutorials, that's where we're really going to get a lot of this, right? But it's helpful to hear it first. Okay. Now, what if I said, if someone is a Terminator, then everyone is? If someone is a Terminator, then everyone is. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, sorry, I meant her, but that's okay. Yeah. Universal. Nice. So we could do it, right? Existential x, T1x, as our antecedent. And then our consequent will be universal x, T1x. Nice. Okay. Cool. Now, here's something fun. First little trick I'm going to teach you. If you have a quantifier whose range is just the consequent, you can put it in front of the whole sentence. So you could plug it like this. But there's a problem. And this is, I just want to flag it for the first time. We're going to get it more as we go along. When you have multiple quantifiers in a sentence, we need to be careful to avoid what we'll call a clash of variables. The jokey version of it is, variables cannot serve two masters at once. You cannot have the same variable attached to two quantifiers that have a shared scope. The way to think about it is, look at this x right here. Which one is it attached to? Is this x attached to this existential? Or is it attached to the universal? We don't know if we're supposed to plug in just somebody, or if everybody can go in here. And this is a grammatical problem. This is a kind of grammatical ambiguity we cannot allow. So, once we get to having multiple quantifiers, we need to make sure to not have this kind of clash. And we can do it really easily. Just change one of these into a different variable. This is why we have a bunch. Remember, you can use anywhere from S to Z. So just take one of the X's and turn it into a Y. So we could have universal Y, existential X, T1X, conditional, T1Y. Yes? Good. So they can, they don't have to. In this case, let's go back to our initial one, right? Let's think, in this, if this sentence is true, and there are any terminators, then they're going to have to be able to apply to the same object. Because it says, hey, if somebody's a terminator, everybody is. So if Socrates is a terminator, then he's going to have to be a terminator. So the different variables can pick out the same object in some sense of pick out. But grammatically, syntactically, we want to keep them distinguished. That's the problem here. Not that, oh, we might plug the same thing in. It's that we don't know grammatically what we're supposed to do here. It's akin to the cases where we didn't have the brackets, so we couldn't read how to use the connectives. In this case, because both of these quantifiers are attached to the same variable and range over the same thing, we don't know if this is supposed to be using this operator or this operator. So it's literally a grammatical problem rather than what can it pick out. It's a good question. Okay. So if we want to do this one, again, we can just change one of these associated variables to one of the other ones. So we could do it this way. For example, one of 1,000 different ways to do it. Now, again, we're diving headlong. Don't despair if it's not clicking. We just started. We've been talking about it for about half an hour now. 40 minutes. Yes? This one is fine. So this sentence up here is totally fine. It's when we get this sort of clash where both of these variables range over or scope over that variable. That's the problem. Basically, think about it as we have two functions, both attached to the same variable, but we don't know which one it's supposed to go into. We need to fix the grammar. Okay. So, the last little bit of kit has to do with something that's near and dear to my heart, though in this case, a genuine tragedy. So, for example, I was over at my friend's house after the football game on Sunday, right? And this is actually true. We drank all the beer that he had in his house, and Alfred went to the fridge, opened the door, and he's like, "Oh fuck, all the beer's gone." And thank God he just meant all the beer was gone in his house. Because if all the beer was gone, then I'm not sure I'd really have much to go on for. I think the world would be over. It's a jokey version. But again, when we hear things like, all the beer's gone, everyone is left, right? These kinds of claims, we implicitly hear them as restricted. When Alf opened the fridge and said, all the beer's gone, he implicitly means in the fridge. And in English, when we say these kinds of expressions, we typically allow for what restrictions we're talking about to just go implicit. We allow context to determine. Everyone passed the midterm. Well, that's weird. I mean, there's a huge population on Earth. Did they just automatically pass because they were just there? Like, surely you mean everyone who was taking the test. These kinds of things. English allows for context to do the job. FOL does not allow for context. So what we need to do, the last little bit of our machinery here, is that we have to explicitly say who it is we're talking about. We have to set out the grouping of things that we want to talk about explicitly. And we do that by specifying what we'll call a domain. And a domain is a set of things that we're going to talk about, a set of individuals in some sense of individual. And an FOL symbolization key specifies the domain. So it could be the things in the fridge. It could be all physical things. It could be universal, literally everything. Some might claim that those are the same domain, but I'm happy to allow for at least the possibility. There's a gap there. All the people who are in the class. all the people who are in this room right now. An FOL symbolization key always has to specify a domain. If it doesn't specify a domain, strictly speaking, the key is incomplete. But for generosity's sake, we'll assume that if the key doesn't include a domain explicitly, it's universal. Now, what's important is that this domain, again, is the things that we're talking about. And that's useful because it's what our quantifiers are going to range over. What does that actually mean? It means that these are the objects apt to be plugged in for our variables. If I say for all x and the domain is things in the fridge, then what I'm saying is, hey, you can plug in place of x everything that's in the fridge. If I'm saying for some x and the domain is in the fridge, then I'm saying there's at least one thing in the fridge that is blah, 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 blah. Point, right? All of the things in the fridge are not beer. Tragedy. There's at least one thing in the fridge that's an expired bottle of white wine, basically vinegar. If we use, say, the domain of people in this room, there's at least one thing, there exists an X, such that it's more than 2 meters tall. How does our machinery figure that out? Well, you can kind of think about the existential as a crane that reaches into the domain and it searches around until it finds something that satisfies the sentence. And if it can find even one thing, then the existential is true. In contrast, the universal is more like a really crappy version of the crane game. It just grabs anything. And in fact, what it does is it grabs every single object and plugs them in. And if every single object satisfies the sentence, then it's happy. But again, the domain specifies the collection of things that our quantifiers can even grab. Okay. So before we go on, yes? Good. Yeah, so we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but yes, we will say it's not the case that there's at least one. Blah, blah, blah. Nice. We're going to get to it, but yes, that's exactly how we do it. So, one other thing about how we think of domains for FOL. This is important. In FOL, the domain cannot be empty. The minimum domain has at least one thing in it. We don't really care what it is, but it's got to have at least one thing. So you can't have an empty domain. Could be one thing. It could be just this little weird catchbox thing. It could be my dog Mira. It could be me. It could be the last beer from the fridge that Alfred and I drank. It doesn't really matter. What matters is you cannot have an empty domain. And this goes hand in hand with something I mentioned earlier, which is that we cannot have empty names. We can't have a name in a symbolization key that doesn't pick out something in the domain. And the reason we want to do this, is we want to be able to capture one particular inference. We want to be able to go from the fact that some object name satisfies a predicate to there is something that satisfies the predicate. We wouldn't be able to do this if both of these assumptions were dropped. So these are simplifying assumptions, but they'll help us for the beginning. So again, domain must have at least one member, and a name must pick out exactly one member of the domain, but a domain may be picked, a member of the domain may be picked up by many or even none of the names available. Beautiful. Okay. But before we press on, how are we feeling about FOL? Again, I know we're throwing a lot at you. But we're going to keep talking about it for the next 3 or 4 weeks. So, feeling okay? Some none, some just blank stares. Trauma. I'm sorry. Okay. Here's my suggestion. It's 36. Let's take a break. We'll take a break till 36 now. Let's take a break to 47. So 10 minutes, give or take. And then we'll come back and do the symbolizations. Sounds good? Okay.